Today I want to talk to you about my interests and research in the retailing management of private label products in the FMCG space, that is in fast-moving consumer goods. This is a hot and exciting area in the Indian retailing context, but it is something that has been a big issue and debated for the last several decades in Europe and US. And so I want to speak to you about some of the studies I've been doing over a period of time in this area. But to begin with, let me define that private labels are brands which are owned by retailers. That is, they're also known as store brands or own brands, and as distinct from national brands, which are brands marketed by manufacturers like Procter & Gamble and Unilever nationally or across the globe. Category management, by the way, is when a retailer looks at all the brands on a shelf together and tries to do his or her marketing mix in a way that maximizes profit from the whole category. But the question is, should a retailer, when they introduce, should they put that into the pot along with the other brands in the shelf, or should they keep it separate? Now, intuitively, most people think that the store brands or private labels are part of the category management at all retailers. In fact, the majority of retailers do not integrate store brands into category management, at least as of today in the United States, for example. And my question was, why don't they do that, and when should they do that, if at all? And my co-authors and I studied that analytically and empirically, and what we find is that it depends on the strategy with respect to the private label, how large the private label should become, and how important it is in the retailer's future plans. But fundamentally, that in the beginning, when the private label is small, it actually is advantageous to keep it away from category management, which is happening with respect to all the other national brands. And that is really because when you do category management, there is some amount of collusive behavior that happens when you manage brands together, which tends to make the national brands' prices go up. So if a retailer's store brand is also in the mix, its price would also go up, and they would lose their natural advantage and ability to gain share. But when you keep it separate, the retailer's store brand tends to gain share because it tends to be more competitively priced. Now, this is simply analytically, you can see this, but when we look at a bunch of products in a retailer before and after they switched to category management and looked at their private label performance, we actually found that those categories where the private label was integrated, the private label did not perform as well, nor were the overall results as good. So this is an interesting nuance, but it is important because organization and strategy in managing these is as important as saying that, oh, we need to have private labels, which many people think is a simple job. Once you have it on the shelf, how should you position it relative to the national brands on the shelf? So shelf placement strategy is very important, and intuitively, many retailers as well as observers think that if the private label is located near the national brand on the shelf, then it will gain some aura from the national brand, or its quality will be perceived as higher, and it will gain some additional sales. The problem is even more complicated because many retailers now have quality tiers of private labels, high, medium, and low quality. And the question is, how should all of them be placed relative to the national brands on the shelf? So a few co-authors and myself working with a retailer in Germany have been studying this using planogram data, which is data on how the retailer organized their shelf in different regions of the country over a period of time. And we could also observe the corresponding sales as they changed the planograms. And what we found were actually somewhat counterintuitive. For example, that if a private label is placed close to the national brand, sometimes it is a national brand which gains in additional sales, especially if you place a premium private label next to the second or third tier national brand. On the other hand, if you place the private labels themselves in a concentrated way on a shelf relative to the national brand, it tends to give more strength to the private label products. And if you place some of the economy national brands, private labels next to the premium national brands, then your economy private label gains, but you will lose some of the national brand sales on the shelf. And you've got to remember that the retailer is actually concerned with profits from all the brands, whatever be the stake in the private label. So these are certain subtle maneuverings which reflect the overall issue, which I think is going to be a big one in India, which is how should private labels compete with national brands? When should the various modernizing retailers, brick and mortar or the online retailers, when should they keep more or less of private labels? And of course, all this is even more exciting in India because the government has certain rules and regulations of its own, which make things even more interesting for an academic like us, like me, to study. So I hope this gives you a brief view of some of the interesting issues on a subject which I think is going to be a big driver of modern India retail in the next few years.